What's up everyone, my name is Biku and I'm here with a bit of a introductory slash very beginner, if you've never used the software before, tutorial and intro to a software called Chitubox. Now if you're like me at all, you are into 3D printing and decided to splurge and get a SLA 3D printer SLA 3D printer, and this is one of the most recommended pieces of software that I have seen. Definitely one of the very few free and open source ones. I believe it is open source. And it's not bad. It takes a little bit of getting used to, especially if you're used to especially if you're used to the FDM focused slicers like Prusa slicer or anything like that. It takes a little bit of getting used to, and things are in some ways exactly the same and in some ways very different. So this is what you get when you start up and you set up. This is the version of the software. I have no idea if this is the newest version or not, but this is the version of the software that came with my printer, although it doesn't seem like there's too many differences between the versions. So if you go to settings here, you can see my machine is a Creality LD002R. I'm probably going to be making a video about the machine somewhat soon, hopefully. And then here are all of your basic settings. You can add new printer profiles here. And then this is where you would manually change things. This is already set up for my printer, so it's got 1440 by 2560 resolution for the LCD. All this was already set up as by the printer because it's one of the supported printers that come with it. Then if you click on Resin, this is where you can put in the different information about your resin. This is more for statistics, so here you can put in how much your resin costs and how dense it is, so that your software can more accurately tell you how much a part is going to cost. If we go to print, this is all, if you're used to FDM printing, this is all going to look very, very foreign. But if you break it down, it's not too bad in terms of how SLA printers work. So layer height, that's the layer height, that's fairly similar. Bottom layer count. Now this is important in SLA 3D printing to make sure that you get a good stick on your bed, because one thing that I've learned is with SLA 3D printing, you've got about 3 hours potentially where you have no clue whether or not the printer started successfully, and you're just sitting waiting until you can finally peek in underneath the bed and see if there's actually a part there. So your bottom layer count will change this setting over here, your bottom exposure time. A longer exposure time, meaning that the resin will be cured longer. It'll just give you a higher chance of the first layers sticking better to the bed, meaning that the rest of the print will go well. Then exposure time over here, that's your standard layer exposure time. That's how long the light will be shining for each different layer. Now for 0.04 or 0.05 millimeters, that's 40 or 50 microns, you don't need a 9-second exposure time. I'd go down to 6, but also it does heavily depend on what kind of resin you're using. If you're using a opaque resin, then you're going to need longer exposure times. If you're using a clear resin, you'll need less exposure times, obviously, because the light can penetrate through quicker. I've used 6-second exposure times on 40 micron layers with clear resin, and it's worked well. I've used 9-second exposure time on 100 micron opaque resin, and that's also worked pretty well. Although I think for the 100 micron opaque resin, I would probably bump it up to more like 11 seconds. Then here, this is all about lifting the bed up. So every layer has to lift up and go back down. This is so that you can unstick the cured resin from the FEP film that it prints onto. FEP is inert and the resin doesn't technically stick to it, but it does stick a little bit in practice. So you need to lift it up so that it can pop off, and you can actually hear the resin pop off or the part pop off from the bed every now and then. So this is how far it'll lift up initially, and this is how far it'll lift up after that. So there's an initial lift up distance, which is for unsticking it, and then there's a further lift distance, and this is the speeds for all of that. So that's all that. Infill. I personally don't feel like resin 3D printers warrant using infill, because you would have to go very, very deep into where your extraction holes for the resin would get trapped inside the infill would go, and I honestly haven't bothered that. I've either done solid or hollow it out, and I'll get to hollowing it out in a couple minutes. And then advanced over here, this is if your printer supports anti-aliasing. It's a feature, strangely enough, originally developed for gaming, but it's where you vary the intensity of the pixels on an edge to be able to create a, in theory, smoother surface. In practice, with a machine that has got a fairly high pixel count, the anti-aliasing doesn't do all that much, but I'd rather keep it on if the machine can do it. So that's the basic settings. Now, in Chitubox, it's fairly simple. One thing that I'll say, that it doesn't seem that any company that makes any form of 3D visualizing software can come to a conclusion on, is what buttons to use when panning or rotating or zooming. So this one is kind of the more traditional, simpler version, where left click is to move around, right click is also to move around, and then right click is to rotate. So if you were getting frustrated, that's how that works. Now over here you've got all of your model editing options. So if we go and import a model, if we go to open file and we open this delightful model of new, we'll see it's massive. It's actually not that massive. These printers typically have very small beds, but in this instance it's absolutely massive and it cannot fit on the bed. So they have a scale to fit button, but this I don't really like using because it doesn't take into account when you add support. So if you click on the support button over here, you can see now every time you go to add supports, it's added this raft effectively, if you want to think of it as a FDM equivalent. This is a raft. But now the model is perfectly scaled to fit, but now the raft is over a bit because of where the towers of support would need to come from. So, and also changing and back and forth between all this is incredibly frustrating. You'll see if you go remove all support and back here. So this is your orientating and editing of your models. What I usually do on this printer, if you double click, it brings up the rotate option, although this I feel like is not the best thing, because sometimes it's not perfectly obvious what each of these rotating rings do, and if you want to move it to C, and then they go away. So if you click here, this is the scale option. It's currently a locked ratio, so it'll scale up and down normally. It won't distort the figure at all. On this printer, I've learned that about 50 millimeters on the X is about as big as I can go while still adding support. You can push it a little bit, but that's just what I've found to be safe. Now, if you want to rotate, the easiest way is to actually orbit it so that you're looking head on, and then double click on it. Then the rings actually appear legible. And one other quite infuriating thing about the software is sometimes, I don't know if it'll do it now, yeah, you can see there, wait, now it's actually behaving, but sometimes, depending on which axis you're looking at it from, if you see there, I'm moving it, and it's moving in the opposite direction of what it would look like it would be moving from. So that gets annoying, but you learn that fairly quickly. So anywhere, if you double click on it, it'll bring up the orbit. Well, not orbit, but to rotate the object, although it's not the easiest thing to use, because if you actually want to orbit it in different ways, you have to move the camera around first. So then you have the top feature up here, which is, sorry, that's actually this very printer beeping at me to tell me that a part is done. This top feature up here is moving around, although this is very limited. Granted, so it's very limited in the sense that it doesn't have a proper way of placing a model on the bed. So there's a option here, put on plate, and that will put whatever the lowest part of the model is on the plate. But if you're used to something like Prusa Slicer, where they've actually got features built in where you can select a face and select that to immediately put that directly onto the bed, it's almost impossible sometimes if you've got a model that's exported weirdly to put it perfectly flat on the build bed. However, with SLA 3D printing, you don't often really want to do that, so that's not the biggest issue ever. But this is fairly useless personally. The put on build plates, as I've discussed, the centering, that works, but then the resets, it resets to the last thing you did. It won't reset to, as you can see, I've just pushed it now and it's not doing anything. It won't reset it to how the model originally came in, which is what you would think it would do. But anyway, actually moving it around, it's easy enough to just move it around with your mouse click. If you click and drag, it'll move around. Now, this is the orbiting. You can click on it again, but again, you've clicked on that and you can manually adjust all this, although this also frustrates me because these are relative degrees of movement and not these change every time you change something else about it, or they reset every time you change something else, so you would never be able to, this isn't from where the model came in, this is from the last thing you've changed. So again, using these actual degrees is not the easiest thing ever, rather just do it by eye. And then there is the scaling. The scaling does work pretty well. It works as well as any other scaling function in any other slicer. You can either go on X, Y, or Z axis and it locks the ratio so that it doesn't turn your part into a weird, it doesn't distort your part weirdly when you scale. So if you did want to do that for some reason, you can choose to not have the axis locked, so you can make a very strange looking Mewtwo, or Mew, sorry. And being an SLS or SLA 3D printer, it would probably print this just fine. It would just look very odd. And I'm going to change this because this is making me concerned. And we'll turn the lock back on. So that's all of the, and there's also a mirror function. The mirror function works fine. As you can see, it takes a couple of seconds, but it will mirror your parts along any of the axes. Now, probably the most useful and the most frustrating part of this software, the supports. Now, like I said earlier, there's this auto-generated raft essentially for the supports, and you can see it's glitching out a bit there. There's a lot of that in the software, but it usually does render out fine when you're actually slicing it. So this is very confusing. They honestly don't make what's happening here all that. They don't make what's happening here all that legible. But what you basically have is, here you can choose how thick you want your support structures to be. For most things on this printer, considering it's a fairly small printer, light is fine. Then over here, you have your top, middle, and bottom. Now what this is the top, middle, and bottom of your support towers. Your top is how it contacts with it. It's either none, it just straight goes into it, or you can have a little sphere that is what attaches the support tower to your piece. Usually I've found none works better because it leaves less of a mark when you're removing the support. Then your contact distance or your contact diameter is how big you want the contact area to be with your parts. and contact depth. This doesn't matter all too much, but it's effectively how deep if you had a sphere or your cone, it's how deep it's penetrating into the model. But in practice, it doesn't really matter. Your more important one is your contact distance. And then connection shape. These also, the supports are so small, I genuinely haven't noticed any difference. Any difference with using all of these different options, so I've just kept it on the defaults, and you can change this, but I'd wager for 90% of stuff the defaults on this is going to be fine. And middle is the middle of it. They don't really make this too clear, and if I'm perfectly honest, I haven't found they don't really make all this clear, but for the most part you don't really have to worry about it. Like, you don't really have to worry too much about all this stuff. Like here you can see model contact on the bottom. They have options there. I believe that is for when it's contacting, it's going off of the model, where support is going off of the model instead of off of the build plate. And then raft, you can change the options of the raft. But when you are actually changing options, it doesn't adjust anything that's already there. So if you wanted to, let's say, change the raft thickness to, let's call it, for some crazy reason, you want a 10 millimeter raft. What you then have to do is remove all, and then if you just want the raft to show because you want to put your own supports, you have to go out and in, and now you can see the raft is there in all of its weirdness. But we don't want a 10 millimeter raft. I found a 3 millimeter raft to be just fine, and now you see I've got to go through this whole convoluted thing again. And then the raft is one of the more important things that you do actually want to adjust. Here you can see the raft shape, skate or none, but skates works fine. Then raft area ratio, that is how far the raft overlaps on the model. So 100% means that it goes to 100% of the boundary of the model. If you changed it to, say, 110%, but as you can see, it doesn't update in real time. So now you have to go out and back in. Now you can see the raft is a little bit bigger because it's adjusting for that change. This is probably my biggest gripe with the software, is they don't do a very good job of any kind of adjustments that you do. So say I wanted to move it now, you've got to change between these two settings. There's no easy way of combining everything. Now there is a auto support option here, and you can change some settings here, but I wouldn't really bother with auto supports. One thing the software does do very well is make it easy and do a very good job of helping you to know where to support your model. So as you can see here, when you look underneath the model, anything that is shaded in red is what the software thinks is a high angle and will probably not print. Obviously you can't print in midair. So with you looking underneath the model, you can see all along Mu's tail is completely impossible to print, and also where it starts and underneath Mu's feet and Mu's head. So what you would do is you can use the add support function, and the biggest thing that changes the most is this light, medium and heavy. I believe this actually just is presets for all of the other settings, but light seems to work well for small things. Then what you want to do is, there's a couple different strategies that I've found that work well. This is your slider for going up and down the model. What I typically do is I go up and down until I find your starting points or your overhangs. And you want to give the most support to your very first, for things that print in midair, because they're going to have nothing else to help them. So I've added 4 supports there, and you see that will help that out a lot. We're going to add more, but that's just where it starts. And then you want to look out for, in the model, where there is free hanging pieces. So that's the only free hanging piece. That's where it starts, and everything will go from there. Then for the rest of it, you just want to look at the model, and you can see there's red all along here. So what you would do is start from the outside in. I found is a good strategy. You just want to click around and make a border around where the red is, and then you can add in a couple more on the inside just to help support it. You know, you don't want to add too many, because that's going to it really will not print very well if you add too many. See, now this is where this software is bugging out a little bit. I haven't actually played around with these square support pillars too much, but you can see there's a couple support pillars themselves that are just kind of in thin air and aren't really coming from anywhere. I haven't had that issue with the circle supports or with the circle support pillars, but it is happening there. So what I'm going to do is remove all supports, and we're going to start again. But now you see there's no raft. So if I go out, go back in, there's a raft again. Yay! And we're going to change this to cylinder. That is what I have found works the best. So now we can go back to doing all of our supports on this. So like before, we're going to add extra supports around where the model starts, just so that we have the highest chance of it working. Then with that done, obviously with different models you might have more than one starting point, and you'll have to help that along more. And this time we're going to start with the tail, and we're just going to go all the way along the tail, and you're just going to want to do what looks about right. This is fairly tedious, although with SLA 3D printing, I would say that most of it is fairly tedious, so it's something that you're going to have to get used to. But the results that they offer are quite remarkable, so it's the price you pay. And then I usually just try and make sure that it's evenly covered. The software is most definitely not perfect. As you can see, I'm going to have to show you, this gives me a good reason to show you the delete function on the supports. As you can see here, they are just random support pillars that are hanging out of absolutely nowhere. So to delete supports that you've added, you can choose this or move this over to the delete support button, and then it doesn't quite tell you clearly where you're clicking, but if you click on the support, it'll highlight that support tower. And then to actually delete them, you hit the delete key on your keyboard. So now that's been deleted. Now, if we move back over to add support, we can try again, and hopefully this time it doesn't give us weird stuff. It is. That's frustrating. I haven't actually had this issue before, so let's just hope that that gets fixed in a bug fix later. But that should be fine for supporting Muse tail. Now if we move over to here, if we choose add support again, we can go around supporting the boundary of where the issues are. You can see here again, there's just random support towers in thin air. The software is definitely not perfect and definitely has a lot of bugs, that much is true, but it is still fairly useful. Now it's just refusing to put support at all. It's possible it has something to do with this model and how I've been scaling it, I'm not too sure. But the gist of it is you want to go around adding supports so that you can see that it's going to give it the highest chance of not failing. So now that that's done, next we're going to want to focus on Muse feet. We'll probably just need 1 or 2 over there, and then 1 or 2 over here. That should be fine. And then the back of Muse head as well, we're going to want to add now you can see what I'm talking about with the frustration. I'm clicking all around and it's just not adding support anywhere. Maybe if I change it to medium support. Nope. I don't believe that changing any of these will fix this issue. This is the first time that I'm having this issue. And I have actually printed this model before. So yeah, let's just move forward. The principle is there. You want to basically make sure that all of the red is covered by supports. And then one thing I do before I print anything is I use the little slider to just work my way through the model and just make sure that anywhere where it is supporting, it looks like it's well supported. So you can see it's going, there's nothing too crazy in terms of overhangs. Anywhere where there is overhangs, it's supporting itself pretty well. And there you go. Now this will obviously heavily depend on what model you're using. But apart from the software's weird glitchy supports out of nowhere, I would say that this has a fairly high chance of printing well. Now if we go back over here, last thing to do is to just check settings. This machine also doesn't do a good job of letting you know that the settings that you're choosing are actually what's going to be done. There's no confirm or save or anything. And yeah, but as long as the settings are here, it's what it's going to use when you click slice. When you click slice. So slicing, depending on the model and depending on the resolution or the layer height that you're printing, can take quite a while. If you're coming from something like Prusa Slicer or any of the FDM 3D printing slicers, this is going to seem hideously long because there's been so much more development time on those slicers compared to resin printing slicers. So this is stuff that is more than likely not going to get ironed out over the years, and it's not something that's going to happen quickly. Now here they give you another preview. This is a preview of what the screen is going to show. So if we go up, we can see there's a nice, what you want is smooth transitions. You don't want any sharp changes or things starting out of nowhere. You want smooth transitions from everything. That looks good, and then you can just click save and it'll save to whatever you want. Now I'm going to show you what auto-generate supports does, mainly just to show you what's wrong with it. So there's two, there's platform and all. As far as I can tell, they do the same thing. If you click just on platform, sometimes it will randomly pop up supports on the model itself, which I'm assuming is what all is supposed to do. I'm not too sure if it's going to do it now. Let's see. This takes an unbearably long time. This is the kind of thing that you click and then you walk away from your computer for a couple minutes and then you come back. Depending on the model, you could actually add the supports in quicker than the auto support does it. But just for argument's sake, let's let it do its thing. As you can tell, the software is not very well optimized, considering it has lots of cores to work with and it's not really doing much. Okay, so the support structure has finished and it's okay. It didn't randomly pop up supports on the model when it wasn't supposed to, so that's good. But as you can see, it's also put supports in very, very obscure places that it's honestly not necessary. Like here randomly on Mew's foot, also here randomly by Mew's ear. The tail is okay, the tail isn't too bad, behind the head isn't too bad. But yeah, there's just a lot of inaccuracies and stuff that I wouldn't think would be necessary. One thing as well is the support often will get very, very close to the model. Now, in theory, SLS3D or SLA 3D printing is unbelievably accurate and this wouldn't cause issues. But in practice, it's best if you can to move supports further away from any freestanding parts of a model if you can. It will minimize the risk of the support touching the model and then issues later cleaning. Say when you're busy cleaning it, your rinse doesn't quite rinse that off, the thin layer of resin doesn't quite get rinsed out of there, and then you're curing the support to the model. Lots of things can happen. So that's stuff that's obviously, this is good for as an attempt by the computer. It's not the best. I've actually had support structures that generate automatically completely fail, and so I have vowed to never use auto supports. But yeah, this would probably print okay, but we can actually take a look at how it starts. You can see we're going up. This is a little bit of an issue on a couple layers. This is a very, very big overhang here for the model to just start printing without helping. That's why I would recommend a couple different support structures there. And then if we go up from there, you can see that's a very big overhang for Resin 3D printers to make. Resin 3D printers do not fare very well with very steep overhangs like that. There's actually a very good video, I can't remember by who, but I'll try and link it in the video, where he explains exactly what's happening when you are curing the resin and how it's more like when it's very, very thin, it's actually very, very floppy. And so when you're doing very big overhangs like that, you'll get artifacts in your printing where it'll almost look like curling on a FDM 3D printer. So because as the cured resin is moving around, it's not completely cured, so it's flopping up and down there, and it's not going to come out nicely. So that's stuff that you need to look for when you're 3D printing. I'll try and link that video in the description. But for the most part, for the rest of it, apart from it thinking that it really needs support on Mew's foot, it's not horrible, but it will vary greatly depending on your model. You can edit or delete auto supports, so if you wanted to use it as like a baseline, you can click and delete all of the ones that you think really aren't necessary. Although if you're getting to this point, I would say rather just do it all yourself. So that is this very, very basic and beginner and completely starting out tour and hopefully helpful guide on how to use the Chitubox software. It has its flaws, as you have been able to see, hopefully, but for the most part, it's pretty good. It doesn't compare to the level of flexibility that FDM 3D printing slices have, but also it's a lot newer, and the accessibility of Resin 3D printers to the masses is not all the same as FDM. So it'll take time, and I expect within a year or two the software is going to be much more fleshed out than it is now. But I hope you all enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. I hope this is useful. Thank you very much, and goodbye.